Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Welcome to part two of differentiation for content area reading. In part one, we talked about differentiating content and process. And in this video, we're going to talk about product and then some notes just at the end about some questions and maybe some misconceptions about differentiation. So again, the work I'm using here is that of Carol Ann Tomlinson, who is one of the most important researchers in the field, whose works really revolutionized, I would argue, differentiation ideas in the 1990s and early 2000s. Some of her ideas have fallen out of favor correctly. She did um, talk about some things that are not true, that are myths in education, like learning styles, which are myths, as I'll talk about in another video. But for the most part, the core of her ideas, I think, are really beneficial. And so those books, which I mentioned in part one, I'm going to link to our ebook versions in the library. Those of you who are on campus can also find print copies in the library of some of them. I think are really useful resources for teachers, particularly teachers of core content areas. When she talks about the product phase, what she's really talking about is a long term product, not really the product of the work of a single lesson, but the product of a unit or really a semester or even an entire year. It's a long term endeavor. So keep that in mind. And I realize that is not going to be practical for many of us in most situations. I think at times we can make product a little simpler and be at the lesson level. And I also think, and I said this in the last part, in part one, that there's a lot of overlap between process and product in, I think, our daily teaching. But the idea here for Tomlinson's idea for product is that it's a long term endeavor that is designed to help students rethink, use, and extend the things that they've been learning in class over a long period of time. And again, that might be a unit, it might be a month, it might be a semester or a trimester, it may be an entire year even. It represents students, I suppose it could be like a week as well, like or several days. It represents the students' extensive understanding and applications of content, and it's a way to give students ownership over part of the curriculum. And of course, students often don't have ownership over curriculum. We want it to cause students to think about, to apply, to expand on the key understanding and skills and whatever the span of learning has been. So let's just talk about it at a unit level for the sake of argument. Now, the format is sometimes dictated by curriculum. So, for example, when I taught seventh grade, we had seventh grade geography. Students had to write a compare and contrast essay describing two countries. Um, I know in elementary school, which is outside of the scope of this course, but just as an example, in many districts in fourth grade, there is a school science fair, and that is a requirement. Schools that participate in National History Day, a National History Day project might be a requirement for a certain course. So sometimes the format will be dictated by the curriculum, but not always. The idea of a format is that we should consider as ways to help students apply ideas and skills, to help them explore modes of expression unfamiliar to them. So again, Tomlinson talks about things like learning preferences and learning profiles, and I mentioned that it's great to give students at times the choice to work in a manner that they like, that they're comfortable with. But it's also important at times to make students step outside of their comfort zones. So, for example, some students might prefer to work independently, and that's great. We should give them those choices. But at times, everyone needs to learn to work collaboratively, and vice versa. Sometimes students love working in groups, they don't want to work on their own, but everyone has to learn how to work on their own as well. So, we want students to have to explore things that are unfamiliar to them as well. And the format can be areas that a student is interested in. The classic example that Tomlinson gives is of, I believe, a fifth grade class, but I might be mistaken about the grade level. It was elementary school, and there was a student who was fascinated with musicals, and as his project in this elementary social studies time, he wrote and directed and produced essentially a musical that was based on U.S. westward expansion in the 19th century. And it was, by all accounts, something completely remarkable. And It's a lovely account to read, and it really reinforces the power that comes when we give students opportunities for choice and engagement in the curriculum that is still connected to the curriculum. I also like to remind students that it is also very unusual. Like that teacher who is sharing the story of that young man, that was a maybe a once in a decade experience for her, I would be willing to bet. I'm not saying that other students didn't also have great learning and really cool ideas at times, but that sort of really completely above and beyond stuff, that is something that is rare, I think. So I don't want you to think that if you start differentiating tomorrow in your classroom, that all of a sudden, by May, your students are going to be producing elaborate music videos or something. That's probably not going to happen, but it's going to have other things happening that sort of would move along that way. We don't always need huge, big things that are really memorable. It's the minor things as well. You as a teacher determine the core expectations of the assignment, of the project, I should say. How students are going to work on it. Will it be independent or collaborative? Is that sort of the baseline or not? What the final product will be. Will it be a science experiment? Will it be a poster? Will it be a slide deck? Will it be a video? Will it be something else? Students should always be able to expand beyond the core. Students should be able to give their input. And then you as a teacher should know and communicate what a quality product looks like. Sometimes you won't know this right away, and that's okay. That happened to me once. I was giving students choice. We had just finished studying, I think, Romeo and Juliet in English is what this particular one was over. And I gave them, using a tic-tac-toe approach, a choice of final projects to do. And one of them was they were supposed to plan a menu as if they were in that time period. And I had one young man who said, "Well, can I do that? And then can I bring in what I planned and like we can eat it in class?" And I said, "Sure, that would be great, so and so. That would be lovely." And I wasn't expecting much. I wasn't expecting him to do it. I said, "You don't have to. All you need is the menu." "Oh, no, no, I want to do it. I want to do it." "Okay." Well, yeah, he brought in the most foul smelling stuff you can imagine because he had made gruel because that's what they would have eaten then. I don't know if Romeo and Juliet specifically were eating gruel. Certainly their servants probably were. But it did not impress me, unfortunately. He was not happy with my reaction. But it wasn't his fault entirely. Like part of it was. He was a little bit smart enough to know better. But like he still got an okay score on it because that was on me for not being clear on indicators of quality. I revised that assignment the next time I taught it. As scaffolding, you as the teacher demonstrate ways in how you can assist students reaching new levels of possibility. And again, the idea of these products is that they should stretch students. But along with that, we need balance, a balance between structure to focus and guide students and freedom to support student innovation and thought. And then as you think about all of that, then you can actually start up thinking about how you're going to differentiate um, and help students work through the different projects you might have them do related to your content. So I want to end by just making some notes of some common concerns that I've seen about differentiation. I first want to say, before I didn't put this as a slide, I probably should have. Differentiation is not a panacea. It is not going to solve all problems in education. It is not going to magically make all students achieve. It is not going to erase achievement gaps or anything like that. There's increasing research, and it's still really small now, but there's starting to be some pushback from advocates for students with different levels of exceptionalities that say that differentiation really doesn't meet their needs in the regular classroom and that maybe they shouldn't always be in the regular classroom. And I first started noticing this a little bit with gifted researchers who argued that just having gifted kids do fun projects doesn't really meet their learning needs, which I tend to agree with. And I've just recently started seeing this a little bit, and it's much, much less developed, but some concerns with advocates for kids with disabilities that maybe this idea that the regular classroom is nearly always the least restrictive environment for kids with disabilities is not, maybe not the answer. And that again, differentiation might not be enough and might not be the most effective way to teach. So I want to point that out. I want to point that out that there is some questioning and there's some pushback, and I think that's valid. But I still think differentiation at its core can be beneficial for learners. I've seen it be beneficial for learners. One key thing here that sometimes gets overlooked is that the key idea of differentiation is giving students a choice. Differentiation needs to involve some aspect of choice. Now, that doesn't mean the choices are wide open. You can have students choose from choice A or choice B, but it needs to be a choice. Now, also, sometimes you're going to guide students very strongly that you really need to make this choice. Like if you're giving different reading levels, for example, you might encourage a student to no, I don't want you to choose this one. I want you to choose that one. Like, but I don't mean that, but I mean like in terms of what process students are doing and what product they're doing, there needs to be student choice. So, for example, at a different institution about 10 years ago now, I was observing a student teacher who was a fine student teacher. I'm sure they were a fine teacher now. And they were student teaching in a middle school classroom, and it was either language arts or social studies. And they had done a lesson, and they were having students do a one pager at the end of the lesson, I believe. And a one pager is essentially it's a visual approach to describing key learning. And it has certain things that it's supposed to include. And in the student's lesson plan, they had written how this was their differentiation because everyone was drawing a picture instead of writing an essay or writing a learning log, whatever, at the end of the assignment. And as I was observing the assignment, I could hear students complain about, I can't believe we have to do this again. Um, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that wasn't differentiation because everybody was doing the same thing. Now, is it a good idea to let students draw sometimes instead of write, even in English class? Yes, it is. It's a great idea, but it's not differentiated. Just because you're doing something you wouldn't normally do, that doesn't make it differentiated. Just because you're having students do something that they wouldn't normally do, that also doesn't make it differentiated. Differentiation needs to involve choice for most types of differentiation. When you're working with students with exceptionalities who have an IEP, use those IEP goals as appropriate as you're working through differentiated ideas. It will often provide guidance and structure for that. It's important to let kids with exceptionalities express themselves in ways other than only written expression. That doesn't mean you don't have to have them also do written expression. Again, the IEP might indicate that or not, but it's important to give them other opportunities as well. And as with all, and that's probably true for all students. And it's also true for all students to consider both strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes teachers go too far one way or the other. Sometimes teachers say, oh, I don't want to even think about a student's weaknesses. I'm only going to build on their strengths. That doesn't help the student, though, because the student needs to work on their weaknesses. But the opposite is also true. If someone has a student, especially a student who struggles, and they say, "Oh well, you know, Alicia is just such a bad oral reader. We're going to work on Alicia's fluency, and that's all we're going to do." That doesn't help either. Alicia also has strengths you need to work on. So for all students, consider both strengths and weaknesses. I also want to mention gifted students. Um, Gifted students learn fast and forever. That's part of a common definition of being gifted that's given by Susan Weinbrenner in one of her books. And what this means for us as teachers is that our students who are academically gifted in our content area need less practice than other students and less review. They also likely read much, much faster. Um, so they understand your new concept in science class after reading it once. They don't need to review it for a week. They also probably don't need to review it in the next unit. Other students probably do. Gifted students don't. Or at least they don't need as much review or as much practice. Obviously, they are still likely going to need some. Very importantly, although cooperative learning is great for most students, cooperative learning, when it's mixed ability groups, is not appropriate for gifted students if it's based on academics. Now, if it's cooperative learning for class building or team building, for social emotional learning, that's great. But when your cooperative learning is based on your content standards and is based on what you're having students do in AP art history, in freshman English, in pre-algebra, in chemistry. Your gifted students don't benefit from being in a mixed ability group. Gifted students should not be given more work than their peers. They should be given different work. It should be a qualitative difference, not a quantitative difference. This is hard, I know, because our tendency is to say, "Oh, look, Leroy's gifted. Leroy got his work done. Here, Leroy, do this enrichment worksheet." That will often tell Leroy that getting his work done quickly, but still well, like he does it quickly, but he does it correctly. He shouldn't do that because you're just going to give him more work then. That's where differentiation comes in. You need to give Leroy assignments that are more challenging from the start so that he is going to put forth a similar amount of effort as his peers over a similar length of time. So do not give gifted students more work. And similarly, this goes back to cooperative learning, do not have them serve as peer tutors. It is fine to have students who are strong in your content serve as peer tutors if they are above average students. But when you get to a student who is truly gifted, I know that's hard in Minnesota because this state um, does not serve gifted students well. It is the worst state in the Upper Midwest in terms of gifted services. I feel safe in saying that for a variety of reasons. Um, so it's hard to say because you won't always know who is truly gifted in your content area because of Minnesota's unfortunate things related to gifted children. A gifted learner is so far above their peers that they aren't capable of explaining it to them. It's many of you have had a college professor or even a teacher in school who was like this, who they knew their content really, really well, but they were just incapable of explaining it to you as a student. That is what a gifted student is like in a cooperative learning group. They are too far above their peers to explain the topic. It leads to frustration on everyone's part, on the part of the gifted student and on the part of the peers. Um, Gifted kids aren't trained teachers. They shouldn't be. And so for an average student or above average student, yes, it's true that teaching someone else can help them firm up and consolidate their learning. That's not true for a gifted kid who's gifted in the subject because again, they learn fast and forever. Their learning has always been consolidated. Don't have gifted kids serve as peer tutors in your classroom, please. And then some misconceptions that teachers sometimes come up with, which are reasonable and valid. So I just want to point out that this is not what I'm asking you to do. I am not saying you should differentiate everything. I never differentiated everything. I differentiated occasionally. Again, we talk about content and process and product. We talked about readiness and interest and learning profile. You don't have to differentiate by all of those things. Pick one. Say, I'm going to differentiate by conduct, by product because I'm going to give students a choice of doing X or Y or Z. You have differentiated. It's also okay to start small. Differentiate one unit in your year. See how it goes. If it goes well, the next year, add another unit that's differentiated. And again, differentiation can be as simple as at the end of a lesson saying you can do X or Y, just two different things. You've differentiated. It's not you're doing everything for everyone. It's not I have to come up with 25 or 30 or 100 different lesson plans. No, you don't. That's not what we're talking about. I am not asking you to do 25 or 35 different tasks. You're usually differentiating for groups. So you're differentiating for your kids who are on grade level, above grade level, below grade level. Occasionally, you are going to need to differentiate for individuals. You have a student in your classroom whose home language is Korean and you have no other Korean speakers. You're going to need to differentiate for that child. You have a child who is highly gifted in your classroom. You have a child who is in your 8th grade classroom who should be in college right now. You need to differentiate for that child. But you don't have to differentiate for everybody. You can usually differentiate by group And you can usually differentiate by simply, again, giving students choices and saying, as you think about, I think this choice is going to be really popular for a group of students. I think this choice is, I think this choice is. Here are the three choices I'm going to give students. So again, no one is asking you to differentiate for everybody. That's a way to burn yourself out as a teacher. So to review, the part one, and for this one, there are three core areas we can differentiate: content, process, and product. Within those areas, there are three ways or aspects we can use in differentiation. We can differentiate by students' readiness. We can differentiate by students' interests, like their academic interests, their interest in just what topics they're interested in. And then students' learning profile. That includes things like how students might prefer to learn. That might include if students are creative or not. That might include maybe students' multiple intelligences and things like that. The purpose of differentiation is to help students learn. We want to teach to the learner, not just to the middle of the class. But again, that doesn't mean you have to do 25 different lesson plans. It just means you need to realize that you have different levels in your class. Teach to groups of those levels. And sometimes your class is just going to have maybe two main levels. Sometimes it might have four instead of three, but very often it's three. You have students who struggle, you have students who are kind of sort of in that middle, and you have students who excel. And you want to make sure that at the end of say a week of learning, all of your students have learned something, whether it be someone who struggles in school, someone who is on track, or someone who excels in school. Let me share with a very personal story um, in a minute. When I taught high school, I was teaching a world history class for gifted first year high school students, for gifted freshmen. Um, and I had a young lady in that class whose name was Kia. And Kia was very bright, and as were her peers, of course. But Kia was probably sort of exceptionally bright, even in that class. And one day we were talking, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Lund, I didn't learn anything in fifth grade." I don't know why fifth grade came up for these freshmen. Like freshmen are kind of all over the place, so it was not an unusual conversation. And I don't believe children. Like I don't believe them when they tell me things like that. I looked at her. I said, "Kia, I'm sure you learned something in fifth grade. Like, okay." And then her little friends, right, her classmates, like, "No, Mr. Lynch, she's right. We went to school with her, and she didn't learn anything in fifth grade because Kia's teacher didn't know what to do with her because she had already mastered the fifth grade curriculum. Like she knew everything." And Kia's teacher put her in front of the computer, and she spent that year playing Oregon Trail. Um, and I'm sure other random computer games. And so I have no doubt that Kia's story was accurate. That Kia, in fact, did not learn anything in fifth grade, and that's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing for any student. It's especially a horrible thing for a student of color like Kia, because it becomes, and it is true, I think, for all students, though, it becomes a civil rights issue. And there's a lot of that in gifted, where gifted advocates are increasingly, and have, well, not increasingly, they have been for decades, pointing that out. And I share Kia's story especially because it has a tragic ending, and it affected me, so it's going to affect you too. Um, about a year ago now, maybe, I think it was just a year ago, maybe it was two. Um, there was a plane crash in Washington D.C. and it was a commuter aircraft in from Wichita, and Kia was on board that plane, and like everyone else on board that plane died. She was in her 20s. Kia had gone to law school. She was a civil rights lawyer in Wichita at the time of her death. She was accomplishing great things, and she accomplished those great things in spite of a public school system that, even in a state that, unlike Minnesota, was supposed to provide gifted services, often failed gifted students. And don't get me wrong, the schools failed gifted students of all backgrounds. They also failed gifted white male students. They failed gifted students of all of different genders and race and ethnicity. So it was not just the fact that Kia was a black student that she was failed by the schools. Or I say not by all the schools. I think I did an okay job with Kia. I think her other teachers in high school often did a fine job with her, but certainly that fifth grade teacher failed her. make sure that all of your students learn. And I understand that on a given lesson, on a given day, that's not going to necessarily happen, and that's okay. But if at the end of a day, at the end of a week, or certainly the end of a month or the end of a marking period, your most highest ability students, as well as your lowest ability students, couldn't think about some things that they learned in your classroom, those students have not been served well. And tomorrow's leaders, like Kia was in her short life, are in your classrooms today and in your classrooms tomorrow for those of you who aren't teaching yet. Again, the idea is that you don't have to do everything for individual students. You're giving students choice, and those choices can be in sort of large groups. So I'm not saying differentiation is easy or that it's not time consuming. It can be challenging, it can be time consuming, but it doesn't have to be. Because again, you don't have to go all in. It's not an all or nothing approach. It is something that if you add differentiated components, it can meet more students' needs better, and it can also be more engaging for more students. It's not magically going to meet all students' needs, most likely, and it's not magically going to engage all students, most likely. But I think it's something that can help along those ways. If you have any questions about differentiation, please let me know. And again, I encourage you to look at those supplemental resources that are in the library. Have a great week. Thanks for watching.